In the previous video, we've finished creating our filter class. In this video, we are going to write tests for our filter, but also for some of these query classes. The only three classes that we will actually make use of within this course for our search form will be the equals, the exist one, as well as percentage, like percentage both sides. Then these are the three classes we are going to write tests for. Obviously, feel free to write the tests for all these other classes as well, but because we're only using these three will be covered with the tests. Okay, if we go to the test directory, then unit, then we are going to the database, statement, and under the statement directory, we're going to create a new one called query. And under this query directory, we're going to start with creating a new class called equals test. And this test needs to extend test case. And here we're going to start with a public function returns correct statement. First of all, we're simply going to test our equals class and make it a test. We start with a query equals new equals. And let's import this class straight away. And we are going to pass the books concatenated with the ID. So table books and ID field on this table. And now what we're going to do is run this assert equals. We expect to get books within the backticks, then concatenated with the ID within the backticks. Equals question mark. That's what this trim white space again query statement method should return when we pass 1 to it. And then equals statement without subquery returned incorrect statement. In case obviously this assertion has failed. So let's have a look at again what we're doing here. So we're using this equals class. If we click on this equals class to get to it, then query, obviously equals class doesn't have anything in it. It just extends the query class. So query class operand is equal symbol, binder is just a dollar symbol. We pass through only the field name. We didn't pass any subquery. We didn't specify whether we want to replace subquery or not. So only field is what we have here. And because we're using this field name, now this field books concatenated with the ID should be converted into this string, this book table within the backticks, concatenated with the backticks and ID in between, and then equals question mark statement. If we check statement has subquery, it doesn't have subquery, so this condition returns false, at which point we are going to this line, and this line simply returns the field which we pass through as an argument. Obviously it's going to be filtered, converted using this field name on the field class, and then operand, which is going to be the equal symbol and the question mark at the end, which is what we're expecting to get. And if it doesn't return this, then obviously something's not quite right. So let's test this statement. Now for the statement, as you can see, if I just go back, for the statement, when using statement, we just pass in the value we want to associate with the placeholder, this question mark, which is going to be later on passed through to the database class for processing with the prepared statement. Okay, so let's run this test. We go to the terminal, PHP unit, we go to tests, unit, database, then we have a statement, query, and we can just run query because there's only one file and there is one test and one assertion which is passing, which is great. That's what we would expect to get. Now the next test is going to be public function returns correct boolean for has subquery, and let's mark it as test. And here we're going to start again with equals. I'm just going to copy this one and paste it here. So we have books ID, and now we are going to run this assert false when we run query has subquery subquery. The subquery is being passed as a second argument, and obviously we only pass the first one. Again, it's if we go to this equals and then query class, the constructor takes 3 arguments, but we only pass the first one. Subquery would be the second one. Obviously, in that case, if I just go back, and then subquery in this case should return false, because subquery property is not an instance of subquery. It will be just null by default. And I've just noticed here that the subquery we use in camel case here, but our subquery actually uses the snake case. So let's convert it. Obviously, this is the wrong association here. It should be subquery property. And then obviously we're checking correctly here with the snake case as well for the subquery. Okay, let's just quickly check if we have anywhere subquery with the camel case. No, that's it. Okay, so that's fine. So yeah, make sure that obviously you rename it correctly as well to make sure that the property name matches obviously the property that we have within this query class. Okay, if we save it and close it, close this equals as well. So has subquery should return false. Otherwise, the message will say equals has subquery return true. Save it and let's run the test again. And now we have 2 tests and 2 assertions, both of which are passing, which is great. Back to the editor. Now what we are going to do is create another query instance. New equals, and we're going to start with a books ID for the field, and then new pivot equals instance. Let's import this class as well. And this pivot equals, and let me just create a few new lines so we can shift it up again. Make sure that we have this semicolon after the instantiation of this equals class. And then pivot equals takes 4 arguments. First one is the table name, author, book. The other one is going to be select field, book ID. Then we're going to have where field, author ID. And then we are going to have end where statement. So books ID equals whatever value we pass through as an argument later on. Okay, so this is our query. So now this query, when we test it with the has subquery, it should return true. So I'm just going to copy this assertion here. This time, rather than assert false, it should return assert true when we run has subquery, and we are going to change the message here, returned false if it failed. And it should return true because this time we pass the subquery, the instance of the subquery. And if we click on this pivot equals, pivot, you can see that this class implements subquery. So this pivot equals also implements it. In other words, if we go back to the query class, this has subquery, now it should return true because this subquery, which is the second argument to this constructor of the query, any of the classes that extend query, is now instance of this subquery. So that's why obviously assert true now should succeed when we run this assertion here on this has subquery method of the query, of this equals class which extends the query. Okay, let's save it, run a test, and there we go, 2 tests, 3 assertions, all of which are passing. Now all these query classes, if I just click on equals and query again, contain this method that check whether we should replace the subquery, which is the third argument to the constructor. So if we check this method here, subquery, replace subquery. So this is what we're going to be writing the test for now, basically to check whether this, when we pass this third argument as true, which by default is set to false. If we pass this third argument as true, then that this specific method, this replace subquery, whether it returns true, which it should. Okay, so the test we're going to write, public function is going to be called returns correct boolean for replace subquery. And that's a test as well. So now we're going to start with the query the same way as before. Query equals new equals, and we pass books ID as the table and field name, and then this assert false when we try query replace subquery. And if it returned true, which obviously would indicate that this assertion failed, equals replace subquery returned true. Let's just add brackets here to indicate it's a method. And obviously I've forgotten to add the comma here. Okay, so let's run this test. Back to our terminal. There we go. We have 3 tests now, 4 assertions, all of which are passing. Let's just clear screen. And after this, next thing we want to do, we start again. I'm going to just copy part of this code here from the previous one, just to save us a little bit of time. So we instantiating the new equals with the box ID, and then we add the second argument, this subquery instance, which is pivot equals, and then third argument, this time we are going to set to true, which means that this replace subquery now should return true. And I'm going to copy this assertion and just rename it. So assert true this time when we call in replace subquery on the query instance, and equals replace subquery returned false if it was to fail. Okay, save it, run the test, and there we go, 3 tests, 5 assertions, all of which are passing. So we now know that this replace subquery works as expected. Now the next thing we want to test is to make sure that we get the correct value, calling the value method. If we just go back here, this public value method, we want to make sure that the value is correctly replaced as well. So we're going to start with a public function. We call it returns correct value. And let's scroll up. Let's make it a test as well. And we're going to start with a query equals new equals. And we start with books ID, same way as before. And now this assert equals, and we assert that it's going to simply equal 1 when we run query value, and we pass 1 through as an argument. If it was to fail, we're going to say equals value returned incorrect value. Okay, let's run it. Same test. There we go. 4 tests, 6 assertions, all of which are passing. And again, I'm going to copy this query new equals with all 3 arguments. Third one set to true. And this time this assert equals this time in between the brackets I'm expecting to have 0 and 0 when I'm running query with value, and I set this value to array, and I'm going to pass strings. As you may remember, within the if we just go back to the query, within this value methods we are replacing the dollar symbol within the binder, which is within the binder basically, because some binders, as you may remember, we're wrapping this dollar symbol with the brackets and so on, with the sanitized value. And what the sanitized value does, it checks if it's not array, if value is not array, which is going to be the opposite of what we're passing, because we're passing the array in this instance. So if it's not an array, just return the value. But otherwise, what we're doing, we array mapping the value, all items within the value go through this int val function, which means it will convert them into integers, because we don't want to allow strings to be passed directly into a SQL statement to prevent obviously SQL injection. And obviously then we are wrapping these values within the brackets. So let's try. Even though equals by default, the binder, if we check, does not contain any brackets, but because we're passing through an array as a value, we will add these brackets here when we return in the statement, and imploding these values sent through as an array as integers at this point with commas within the brackets basically. Okay, so this is what we're expecting when we pass array of any items, and obviously 2 items because we have 2 integers here in this returned statement, what we're expecting actually. And I'm just going to type in the first value and then second value, for instance. So these 2, because they are strings and because they are in as array, not because they are strings, because we're passing the array through, all these values should be converted to integers. And then message, we're going to say equals value returned incorrect value for subquery replacement. Okay, let's save it, run the test, and there we go. For test this time 7 assertions, all of which are passing. So our array of values, string values, have been correctly converted into integers and wrapped with a set of brackets and then concatenated with a comma. And now another assertion we're going to have here is this assert equals, actually let's just copy what we've got here because it's going to be a little bit quicker. Okay, this time I'm expecting to have 2 and say 18 when we are passing array as well, but of integers this time. So 2 and 18 is what I'm passing. I should receive this, because even if we run int_val function on the integer, when we run it on the integer, it's just going to return the integer that we're passing through to this function. Otherwise, obviously, if it's a string, it's going to convert it to integer. By default, it's going to be 0. Okay, so equals value returned incorrect value for subquery replacement. Perhaps we should add a little bit more to this message here with this array of strings. And here for the second one, we are going to say with array of integers. Okay, let's save it and see if it's going to pass, and it does. So you have 4 test, 8 assertions. Everything seems to be working the way we would expect it to. And now we're going to start writing the test for the usage of this equals class with the filter class.